I'm sitting on a boat on the Nile in Cairo, which is located about 15 miles north of Egypt's ancient capital, Memphis. Scholars believe ancient Egypt is one of the 6 earliest cradles of civilization in the Old World. Ancient Egypt grew independent of other civilizations in other locations, and trade was incredibly instrumental to this growth. Throughout the Old World and New, history has been shaped by the exchange of money, goods, and services. Even in Scripture, we see trade and commerce serving as a backdrop to much of what we understand about God and His people. Trade equaled influence, and to this day, capital drives progress, innovation, and opportunity. Those who own the capital possess the ability to influence their individual companies and the clients they serve. Money can impact the broader financial markets as well. The question for any faith-driven investor is this: how will we use this power? Finny Kuruvilla is a friend and fellow faith-driven investor. He's also the business partner of Rob and John, my co-host for this series. Finny is someone who pushes the faith-driven movement conversation ever forward. And as this movement grows wider, he speaks to the necessity of us being aware of the power of money and markets. Before we hear from Finny, we'll learn more about his firm, Eventide. Based in Boston, Eventide has an intentional way of using the power of the markets to make an impact for good. It's an inspiring story. Let's watch.
The more that I have been alive on this planet, the more I have seen how incredibly influential capital is to shape the world in so many different ways. That really what capital is fundamentally the ability to direct creativity and resources in one direction or another. One of the dreams that we had in starting Eventide is this concept of enlarging the common good and thinking about how the enlargement of the common good can also be a platform for the redemptive good. We're trying to show the world what it can look like if people actually love one another and do that in a systematic, comprehensive, business-centered way. That gives us the ability to now be, at least in some way, the city on a hill that Jesus wants us to be.
Proverbs chapter 11, it says, when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. But when the wicked prosper, the people groan. Proverbs also says, when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. And when the wicked are defeated, there are shouts of joy. The righteous are people that prosper by taking care of their cities, by uplifting the poor. And as they prosper, they continue to uplift the poor. Whereas the wicked are people that often prosper through exploitation. As the wicked are prospering, the people are groaning because the wicked are people that are hurting the poor in the city. So we want to partner with companies that are uplifting their communities and the whole of society.
So in February 2021, in our normal course of business, we were analyzing companies in the solar and clean energy space, and we started to see headlines linking forced labor in China to some solar companies, and that really caused immediate alarm. And we did about 3 months of research, intensive research, across the spectrum from the solar supply chain to the greater context of oppression of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang in China. And we began to really engage the industry, starting with companies, starting with CEOs and leaders. The industry really wasn't aware of this. And further, they certainly didn't have a solution. And so what we wanted to do was lend our voice as investors to this critical resource, solar energy, this critical technology, and educate the market on, one, here's how forced labor is wrapped into the supply chain. Two, here's the broader context of oppression. We wanted to appeal to people so that they would really understand that this isn't sort of a traditional forced labor situation. It's instituted by the government that is massive in scale, And then 3, provide a solution. So we've developed a market-based solution that transitions the supply chain away from forced labor, starting with companies that you would buy from if you wanted to buy a solar panel, and then gradually working all the way down to the raw materials.
The thesis of Eventide is that investing is ownership, and that ownership confers ethical responsibility to the owner for the actions of the company. And so we therefore want to avoid things that are harming individuals. We want to avoid activities that are taking advantage of people. And then we want to celebrate and pursue wholeheartedly companies that are blessing the world, that are adding value to the world, that are promoting the global common good.
So we were praying about like what we should do in terms of how do we help Christians invest money. And there were just principles that we saw in the Bible. And one of the principles that we saw was avoiding ill-gotten gain. Proverbs 1 has a whole passage about avoiding ill-gotten gain and not sharing a purse with people that plunder. So early on, we created a kind of an avoidance list. So we said, okay, these are definitely problem areas. Christians would not or should not profit and partner with businesses that do these types of things.
Investing is ownership, company ownership. It's a very helpful metaphor for thinking about what's happening when you invest. You're owning specific businesses. These businesses are not buildings, they're a network of relationships that impact our neighbors. Capital should be a servant in the world, that it should be something that creates and enlarges flourishing. Back in the early 1600s, we got the introduction of the stock and the bond as a financing mechanism for business. But what happened is that the early stocks and bonds were tremendously successful, very, very successful, and many people made fortunes. And word about the fortunes of those early investments spread very rapidly. And what happened is, gradually, people began to pay less and less attention to what these stocks and bonds, what company was behind them. And so there was basically the Christian community began to be disturbed by this phenomenon that capital would be going toward things without a lot of intentionality and thought behind it. And this culminated in John Wesley, who was an English minister in the 1700s, preaching a sermon to his congregation called The Use of Money, where he dealt very directly with how we should be thinking about investing our money. And so that was really, in many ways, the beginning of the responsible investing movement that we know today. In fact, secular historians say that sermon was the starting place of the entire movement. It began as a Christian movement. And it was really driven by this desire to not separate the returns of investing from the impact of investing, but to consider them both with one mind. I think one of the things that stands out in the Eventide culture is that the reason we are gathered together and working together is to pursue a sense of calling or a mission together.
A lot of my colleagues are of the Christian faith, and I think that's awesome. I'm personally of the Jewish faith, and I think there are a lot of shared values. I was born in Ukraine just before the fall of the Soviet Union to a Jewish father and a Russian mother. And we left Ukraine, which was our home, because one, we saw better economic opportunities elsewhere after the fall of the Soviet Union. And two, because there was still anti-Semitism in Ukraine and we didn't feel safe being there. So what I have here now in my life in the US, thanks to my parents and my grandparents, is a life of, boundless opportunity. And that's what I want to try to give to people through my career and also through my giving and volunteering, opportunities to be successful, to have a fulfilling life that sustains financially and spiritually, and also a place where people feel like they belong.
Eventide's approach to values-based investing is grounded in the belief that humankind was created with intrinsic dignity, value, and worth. Business 360 is the process by which we look to and embrace companies that we believe God would say, yes, you should profit from that because it is producing what we call human flourishing. So we take a holistic approach that I think is also unique, that's really just rooted in this expression of desiring to perpetuate what God says is good.
We in the West, I mean, we have such privilege. We have no idea how privileged we are. And with all of the privilege comes great responsibility. And my contention is that given how much capital we have, I mean, there's no society even remotely close to where we are in the United States today. And so how is it that we don't view that as a privilege, as an opportunity to take that wealth, the talents that God has given us, and deploy that to serve others in ways that are in keeping with our fundamental mandate to love our neighbor?
John Wesley preached, make all you can to give all you can, but make all you can without hurting yourself or your neighbor in body or in soul. We often only say make all you can to give all you can. But the other side of that equation is how you make your money, how you go about conducting business. What are the types of businesses we even start? Even going back to the book of Genesis, when God creates, he calls good over and over the thing that he creates. So if he created us in his image, and if work is given to us even before the fall happened, question is, what types of work, what types of businesses, and what type of investing should we be engaging in?
We're really coming up against an industry of finance that has been trained to think about things according to the story of the world. And I think we've spent much less time reflecting on God's story for work, for business, for investing, and really saying, how can we bring this story into our lives? How can we become a part of God's story? How can we live that out? Only then, I think, are we going to see a significant movement in the church. Only then are we going to see people being very excited about investment opportunities like Eventide or others.
When you look at the total capital that Christians have at their disposal and how much of that is deployed in manners that are sensitive to faith issues, I mean, we're looking at certainly less than 1%, but it is a tiny, tiny percentage right now. But the time is now, and those who join us now in this endeavor, I think will experience the joys of what it's like to start a movement from the very beginning. And so it depends on that interplay of the common good and the redemptive good. And I think that all the things that we're doing here are hopefully in service of this goal of getting the church to a place of health holistically across all different dimensions, not just personal dealings with sin, but financially dealing with our vocational capital, getting the church in a healthy place so that we can begin to do what God has called us to do with delivering the Great Commission to the ends of the earth. So that's my big dream, and I hope to play at least a small part in that dream. How do you change the world? I'm not looking for platitudes or nice sentiments. I'm looking for tangible, practical strategy rooted in sound principles. Our world is changing rapidly and not always for the best. Thus, for good reason, there's a lot of talk today about how to change the world for the good. There's a lot of young people who hope to use their lives to change the world. And there's a lot of older people who want to use their influence to change the world. So how do you actually do it? Let's first dispel two common myths of world change strategies. First, the power to change the world is not found in politics. Politicians make lots of promises they rarely keep. They've got to make lots of deals and concessions to get them elected, which in turn makes them beholden to other constituencies. And then on top of that, politicians have their fingers up to figure out which way the wind is blowing so that they can get reelected. But what makes that wind blow? Politicians in general are much more reactive than transformational. The second myth is that world change happens because of autonomous individuals, especially in America, where we tend to lift up rugged individualism. It's easy to fall for this myth. In his book, To Change the World, sociologist James Davison Hunter makes a compelling argument that the real power to change the world lies with institutions. Certain institutions have concentrated power to shape hearts, attitudes, and beliefs. Think of school systems, churches, Hollywood, social media, or the news. Certain institutions have concentrated power to affect how you spend your time. Think of professional sports leagues, for example. By the way, these leagues are for-profit businesses, and how many millions of hours that people spend watching those activities. Or how many young people dream of being like Michael Jordan or LeBron James, Ronaldo, Serena Williams. There's other institutions that have concentrated power to shape spending. Think of the people who make commercials. Think of all the online businesses like Amazon or brick and mortar places like shopping malls. It's difficult to overstate all of these forces. In fact, we're a little bit like fish that swim in water, but we can't tell you what water is because it's our only experience. In the book of Colossians, Paul talks about dominions, principalities, and powers that are both visible and invisible. These forces define and shape our existence. And if you can change these forces, you can change the world. I'm going to be focusing mostly on business here, but I want to illustrate world change with two historic examples. Let's start with the very famous voyage of Christopher Columbus. Most of us know he wanted to get to India, but this enterprise of transoceanic sailing was risky and expensive. You needed investors to supply the capital for such an endeavor. So Columbus traveled all around Europe looking for investors. He unsuccessfully went to France and England to procure these investors. After failing there, he eventually got support from Spanish investors. Make no mistake about it, this was very much a business proposition. Columbus took their capital, and in exchange for his labor, he arranged a contract where he personally would get 10% of future revenues from such expeditions, and he also got the option to invest in 1/8 of future commercial businesses that came from his explorations. Now, the rest of his voyage is history, but I want us to think for a moment about an alternative narrative. What if Columbus secured French investors? Central and South America today would be French-speaking and have a very different culture. What if Columbus secured British investors? Central and South America would be English-speaking and Protestant, not Catholic. Think of the hundreds of millions of people affected by this small group of investors and explorers. These investors that backed Columbus changed the world. As a second example, consider the British East India Company that was formed in 1600. Many people consider this to be the first modern corporation, financed with a complex mixture of stocks and bonds, and they even had an exchange. Through the influence of this company, India would go on to become a colony of England. That has affected the culture, the language, and the politics of India. And you may not know that India has the second largest English-speaking population on the earth. Billions of people have been changed by the geopolitical power of these corporations. Now let's jump to the future. Consider the modern multinational corporation. How much has Google, Facebook, and Nike changed our habits, our desires, and even our vocabulary? Companies were funded by venture investors as well as public investors. These investors changed the world through these companies. I want to change gears a little bit and talk a bit more about some of the ethics. The thesis that I'm going to lay out is very simple. By willfully becoming an owner of a company or an owner of a business, which is what investing is, you are sanctioning and benefiting from the company's activities and practices. This ownership confers an ethical responsibility to the investor for the activities and practices of the company. Investing has long been, however, divorced from this original and basic purpose, which is supplying capital to support businesses. Instead, most investors today are trying to profit from the market itself, rather than any productive and intrinsic value of the underlying companies. Basically, investing today has become about making money. The mantra is low cost, low fee products like ETFs, and investing has become commoditized and depersonalized. Frankly, most people don't even know what companies they own. Investors have forfeited the power to change the world using their hard-earned capital. To convince you of a more modern example of the positive power of investing, I want to share one last example of what can happen if we work together. Let's go to the year 1971. In 1971, Christians were having a growing concern for apartheid. If you don't know what apartheid is, it's an Afrikaans word that means separation. It literally means aparthood. It's basically institutionalized racial segregation. Apartheid was practiced, of course, in South Africa, and the government had already ignored UN sanctions and embargoes. But a group of Episcopal shareholders filed a shareholder resolution with General Motors, a well-known car company. Many people believe this to be the first example of modern shareholder advocacy. They enrolled the help of a Baptist minister whose name was Leon Sullivan. He was an anti-apartheid activist, and Sullivan proposed specific resolutions for the General Motors board that they ended up adopting because of this Episcopal shareholder resolution. After GM adopted these resolutions, then Ford and Goodyear followed suit. Thus, one of the key instruments in the fall of apartheid was coordinated investor pressure from Christians. Think of the many, many problems that we face today: lack of access to clean water, polluted air, difficult jobs, diseases like cancer, Alzheimer's, infections like coronavirus, educational systems that can warp students' minds, misinformation and confusion in the media. Every one of these problems could be fixed through institutions, specifically virtuous businesses and a strong church. These are the sleeping giants that we can enable through our investing and participation. Right now, we need all of us to deploy our capital in positive ways to shape the world for the good using biblical principles that promote human flourishing. So let's use investing as a tool to positively change the world. Thank you.
Wielding the influence of capital is no minor responsibility. As Finny reminds us, if you really want to change the world, then you have to be able to change institutions. And who better to do that than faith-driven investors? In other words, capital equals influence. Throughout history, we've witnessed economic might winning wars, drawing borders, and even driving culture. Are you ready or even willing to accept the responsibility of this influence? It begins with us being better informed about the companies we own, the purpose of the businesses we finance, and what our role is as an investor to promote the common good. Luke writes in Acts 20:28, "Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood." God calls us to pay careful attention to ourselves and to all the flock and to care for the church. This extends to our investments as well. Faith-driven investors use the influence of capital to make products and services, to create company cultures that support and empower employees, to launch faith-based employee resource groups, to advocate for chaplaincy, the list goes on. This intentional and impactful use of capital will be a mark for which we are known and remembered. We're responsible for leveraging the power generated by the force of investing. But investing for the common good will only succeed if faith-driven investors recognize and accept the invitation to participate in the fruits of investing, as well as become an agent of change. Now, spend some time in your group talking about this session and how it relates to the journey that you're on. Open yourselves up to learning from one another. Be honest with each other. What you get out of this time together will only be as enriching and life-giving as what you put into it. See you next session.